And here we go. All right, everyone. First of all, thank you for coming to the class. This is the Understanding the Appraisal Contingency. This is as of July 19th, 2018. I like to disclaim these things because, as you know, contracts are constantly changing. And actually, the next contract that WRA is going to change is the offer to purchase. When that's going to happen, I don't know if it'll be in 2018, 2019. I'm not sure when that's going to be. I doubt it'll be any more this year. Probably next year is when we'll see a new one. So, so this is as of this date. I'm going over these things. I have a outline for you at the end of the desk. If everyone has one of these. Oh yeah, if you'd sign in too, please, I'd appreciate it. All right, so today's class is Understanding the Appraisal Contingency, and that's all I'm going to talk about. If you guys have any questions in regards to the appraisal contingency and how it works, let me know. But the outline I gave you will give you a pretty good idea as to exactly how to use it and when to use it and under what circumstances you should use it. So I'm just going to begin now with the appraisal contingency that appears in the offer to purchase. Remember, in Northeast Wisconsin, we have two different appraisal contingencies, one that's in the offer, one that's in the addendum A. Whenever you fill out an offer and you include the addendum A, make sure you only select one of the two. Don't select both. If you select both, the one in addendum A wins. So it cancels out what's in the offer. So just as a reminder, just be careful which one you're going to do. But probably more importantly, there are different circumstances as to when you will be using the appraisal contingencies. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to begin by reading the contingency. This is line 264 of the offer to purchase. This offer is contingent upon the buyer or the buyer's lender having the property appraised at the buyer's expense by a Wisconsin licensed or certified independent appraiser who issues an appraisal report dated subsequent to the date of this offer, indicating an appraised value of the property equal to or greater than the agreed upon purchase price. This contingency shall be deemed satisfied unless the buyer within blank number of days of acceptance delivers to the seller a copy of the appraisal report which indicates that the appraisal value is not equal to or greater than the agreed upon purchase price, accompanied by written notice of termination. So what I'm going to do is the first half of this class is we're just going to analyze that whole contingency and talk about what all of that means and how it really works. Now, when you would use this contingency is generally when you have a buyer agency agreement. Whenever you have any sort of contract agreement with someone, to really advocate for someone, the best thing you can do is during a transaction, if your client has the ability to make the first decision, they generally are the ones who are in control. So position your offer or write your offer in such a way where the client, whether it be yours or the seller, is actually in control and has the ability to say the first thing. In the appraisal contingency, in the offer to purchase, the buyer has the right to be able to do the first thing. The seller does not have the right to cure, and the buyer can cancel if they want. Now, a couple of other things that I want to talk about real quick about the appraisal contingency in general. As we discussed earlier before the class started, the appraisal can be ordered by the bank if it's going to be financed, or if a buyer is paying cash, the buyer can order an appraisal themselves too and still make this offer contingent upon a satisfactory appraisal. It's going to cost the buyer about $500, about the usual cost that it is when you have a lender do it. But you can still make it contingent upon appraisal even though there's no financing that's involved. Something to keep in mind when you work with a cash buyer. When my dad bought a cabin up north, it was cash, but I talked him into having an appraisal done, which we found out was the offer price was a little bit too high, and we adjusted accordingly. So he was able to pay cash, but at least we got an independent third party to say, no, we think it's worth this. Maybe not what you're offering, but we think it's worth this. All negotiations in regards to the appraisal contingency, all negotiations, all amendment agreements, or any cancellation mutual release agreements must be completed before the deadline. So if you have an appraisal contingency And after we go through all the different scenarios that could happen, there could be an amendment, there could be a notice, there might be a cancellation mutual release. All of that has to be done within the time frame that you've selected for how long the appraisal contingency is going to be. It has to be done by that time. Done, delivered, all parties agreed upon. You can't just have the appraisal done and then worry about negotiating and let that deadline go by. So make sure you give yourself plenty of time to get the appraisal taken care of. What a lot of lenders will do is wait till the home inspection is done and then order the appraisal, which can be good or bad. I mean, sometimes if an offer is going to fall apart, it would be at the home inspection. So why order a $500 appraisal if we're not going to go forward with the purchase? I can understand that. But if you're working in a very tight time frame, you might want to have some conversations with the lender to say, we need to be doing these things on a parallel track, because we do need to get this done pretty quickly. That's going to be a discussion that you're going to have with your buyer as to how you're going to want to handle that. Lately, though, I've been noticing lenders ordering the appraisal without waiting for the home inspection contingency to be taken care of. Every lender is going to be a little bit different. I'm just letting you know that there is that thought process out there amongst lenders. Let's wait till the home inspection is done and then order the appraisal. If that's what ends up happening, you might want to talk to your buyer about getting that home inspection done right away too, so it can trigger the appraisal and you can get everything done on time. All right, so now let's say that you have selected this and you have the appraisal, and the appraisal comes in and it's low. We're going to talk about what's going to happen now if it comes in low. The very first thing, that if the appraisal comes in low, we have to understand that in the addendum A, the seller does not have the right to cure, so the buyer gets to make the first decision. What I would recommend you do is talk with your buyer and see what they would like to do. It's conceivable that if the appraisal comes in low, the buyer could say, fine, I want out of this offer. Because maybe leading up to this point, everything else has been a disaster, and now they have an opportunity to just get out. And they have a right to do it. If the appraisal came in low, the buyer can say, I'm out, I'm done, get their earnest money back and move on. So you need to talk to the buyer and find out really what they want to do. Whatever you do, at this point, don't send a copy of the appraisal report to the seller yet. We'll talk about when that does, because when you do that, it triggers a number of things that are going to happen within the appraisal contingency. The seller then has 5 days to consider things, and I'll be going over that in a minute. But when you first get the appraisal and you find out it comes in low, talk to the buyer, see what the buyer says, and see what the buyer wants to do. It's conceivable also the buyer could say, yeah, I came in $2,000 short. I'll just pay the extra $2,000 and we'll move on. That's fine. Actually, you'd be surprised how many buyers have said that. They could say, well, let's see if we can negotiate something in between. That's a possibility that's available too. The seller might agree to come down 1,000, the buyer comes up 1,000. If all parties agree to that, you do an amendment and you move forward. The important point I wanted to make here, though, is talk to the buyer and see what the buyer wants to do. And then we'll be able to advise them as to what their course of action is going to be. If the buyer decides they want to cancel the offer, what all the buyer then has to do is supply a copy of the appraisal report along with a cancellation and mutual release. The seller would sign that because, remember, this is the buyer saying, I don't want the house. It didn't appraise. I don't want the house. I want to cancel. So you got to give them a copy of the appraisal report and the termination paperwork, which is the cancellation and mutual release. So at that point, it's canceled. Buyer gets their earnest money back and they move on. The buyer, even though the seller doesn't have the right to cure, the buyer can still ask the seller to do it. They don't have to cancel it. They can still say, yeah, I know you don't have the right to cure, and I know it came in low, but if you want to lower the price, I'll still buy it, if that's okay. That's part of that negotiation that I talked about, and trying to have an understanding from the buyer as to what they would like to do. So you do have that ability to still negotiate at this point. If the seller refuses to lower the price, the buyer still has the option to cancel the offer. So just because the buyer says, well, let's give the seller a chance and see if they'll lower it, doesn't mean they've now lost their ability to cancel the offer. So let's say the seller does not have the right to cure. The appraisal comes in low. The buyer says, hey, you want to lower the price anyway? Seller says, no, I really don't think so. The seller can, or the buyer then can say, well, then if that's the case, I'm still going to cancel my offer at this point. So the buyer doesn't lose their opportunity to cancel just because they want to see if the seller is willing to negotiate. So that's something to keep in mind if in the event this happens. If indeed, though, the seller agrees to lower the price, what you are going to have to do is write an amendment, changing the purchase price. So you would change the purchase price, the amendment say purchase price is changed to, we'll say $102,000. And then a second line would state, signing of this amendment satisfies the home or satisfies the appraisal contingency. You're going to want to have some sort of documentation on that amendment that changes the price, that now, because of that amendment, the appraisal contingency is now satisfied. Never waive it, say it's satisfied. Remember that if you change the price on an appraisal, all the other terms remain the same. So let's say you offer $153,000 and you have $3,000 in closing costs. The appraisal comes in at $150,000. That $3,000 in closing costs still stays in the offer. You're just lowering the price, but keeping all the other terms the same. What might happen, and what often happens, is the seller would say, all right, I'll lower it to 150, but now I will only do that if we lower the closing costs, or if I delete them altogether. And then that becomes a negotiation between the buyer and the seller. We get back to that negotiation again as to what could happen. And then buyer and seller might come to some sort of compromise. If indeed that happens, again, you just write the amendment saying we agree to these things, and then make sure the appraisal contingency is then satisfied. Okay, I already talked about the negotiation with the appraisal. Now, if the appraisal comes in at or above purchase price, everything just remains the same. You just continue on with the transaction. The buyer can't withdraw the offer, because in the appraisal contingency, it specifically says if it comes in under the accepted offer price, but if it comes in at or above, they're going to still continue on. So also remember, the seller can't change the price because maybe it came in higher. June had a home, $175,000 was the accepted offer price. It appraised at $195,000. There's no way I'm showing that seller that appraisal, because all I'm going to do is say, we're good, no worries, let's just continue on with this. It appraised out just fine. So, and that's a good practice would be to make sure you give the seller a notice stating that the appraisal contingency is satisfied. It's just a good practice. You don't have to. Quite frankly, a lot of people don't, but it's just a good practice. And again, a reminder, do not share the appraisal report with the seller. They're not entitled to it like the home inspection report. They're not entitled to that appraisal report. They only get it if you want them to lower the price, because they have a right to look at the report and see if it's in their opinion, a legitimate report or not, and then decide what they want to do. They might look at this report and see the comps that are involved and see, understand what's going on. They go, yeah, the dude's got a point. I'm going to lower the price. This appraisal makes sense. Which, by the way, getting an appraiser to change their appraisal is next to impossible. Next to impossible. So it's just something to keep in mind if you do get one that comes in bad. If one does come in bad or low, the buyer has to initiate the appeal. The agents can't. The buyer would have to do it. Because remember, the appraisal is an agreement that we're making it contingent upon, but it's something that the buyer and the financing and the buyer and the bank are using to make their determination as to what they want to do. It doesn't, whoever has the right to cure or the ability to make the first decision, that remains. But if the buyer wishes to contest that appraisal, it's the buyer's decision to reach out to the lender and ask to do that. Now, as an agent, you can help with that by supplying comps. You can supply them some homes that you think would be good to use as part of the appraisal, but don't understand that there's no guarantee they have to use them. What will happen is then they will contact the appraiser. They'll ask the appraiser, why didn't you use this, this, or this, or why did you use the ones that you did? The appraiser would then support their rationale as to why they did it. And then usually the bank ends up siding with the appraiser on this. Understand that the appraiser has far greater restrictions on them when deciding how to do an appraisal than we do when we do a CMA. The appraiser actually has regulated restrictions as to what they can do, to the point of distance, how old the sale is, what community are you in. Sometimes with difficult homes, like a country home, we'll take just about anything in Outagamie County. Because, one would assume that if you're going to live in the country, it doesn't matter specifically what little town you're in. It's going to be more important the acreage, the location, that sort of thing. But an appraiser would have restrictions as if you're going to be doing something in the town of Center, you can only use like northwest Outagamie County for appraisal locations. And you can't go to the rest of the county, which now puts the appraiser in a very difficult position. One thing, again, also to talk to your sellers about is if you're going to be listing a property that you look at this and go, I don't know, I had a hard time finding comps. I can imagine the appraiser's going to have an even harder time finding comps. It's something for you to warn the seller about, that if you might come up with a price, but the appraiser might have a different idea about it. So it's just something for them to be prepared about. I mean, a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in the south side of Appleton, 130 all day long. Finished basement, 145 all day long. You don't have to worry about that. But more obscure type of properties, or ones that are a little bit further out, if you have a hard time doing a market analysis on it, the appraiser is going to have a hard time doing a market analysis on it. So that's just something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind, if you're listing a property and it's time for the appraisal, it is perfectly fine for you to lay out the CMA that you've done so the appraiser can see what properties you've used. An important thing for you to do is, and this is going to help with your appraisal also, in your description, write as many important things about the house as you possibly can. New tile floor in 2017, updated furnace in 2018, do this. Because now the appraiser is going to looks at your spec sheet. And and if you're able to detail all the things that have been done to that property, or you attach to that spec sheet the documents, and it's got the seller update that lists all those things, the appraiser can now look at this and go, wow, they did do a lot of updating for this, and now maybe look at it with a different eye, with a different point of view, and they can understand why maybe your house is priced a little higher than the rest of the comps. But if your house has had a ton of updates, it now supports a slightly higher price. So it's always a good idea to go ahead and list as many updates as you can, so the appraiser has that. It's okay for you leave out the CMA or what houses you used as comps to develop the price on this property. It's okay to leave that out there for them too. So just a couple of hints that I actually got directly from appraisers as to what they would like to see agents do to help them do their job. All right, now if you flip over the sheet, we're going to talk about, well, first of all, before we do that, any questions on the appraisal contingency in the offer to purchase? I know I kind of went over it quick, but it is pretty straightforward. If the appraisal comes in at or above, which is more often than what it's going to be, then everything's fine. You move forward. If it comes in below, always the best thing to do is, first of all, talk to the buyer, see what the buyer wants to do. If the buyer wants to cancel, follow the procedure to cancel. If the buyer wants to negotiate, begin the negotiations by merely talking with the other agent. But if you're not able to come to some sort of agreement with the agent, then begin the actual implementation of sending over the notice. The seller still has the right to be able to agree to lower the price if they want, but then they might not agree to it, and then you'll be able to follow forward with the cancellation. But either way, it's going to work out in the buyer's behalf, and the buyer's going to decide what direction we're going to go with this. So now the next appraisal contingency is going to appear in the addendum A. I'm going to scroll down to that right now. Remember, make sure you only select one of the two. Then I went too far, didn't I? No. There we go, right there. All right, this does give the seller the right to cure. Now, an important thing to remember about this particular appraisal contingency, if you remember about a year ago or so, if you did a FHA loan or a VA loan, right after you got the accepted offer, the loan officer would send to you what's called an FHA or VA amendatory clause. And what it said was that it regardless of what's in the offer, if the house doesn't appraise out at or above the purchase price, the seller has the right to cancel the offer. And it even states it in there. It's very clear. Doesn't matter what you guys put in the offer, we're changing it to this. And that used to happen all the time. It still happens all the time with FHA. Right, but they've changed the wording. They've changed the wording to make it more what's in the addendum A than in what's in the offer to purchase. They've changed it literally within the last year to say the buyer doesn't necessarily have the right to cancel it, that the seller has the right to lower the price, and if the seller doesn't, then the buyer has the right to cancel. So they actually changed the wording in that FHA or VA mandatory clause to be what's more in the addendum A. All right, so I'm just going to read the addendum A. This offer is contingent upon the buyer or buyer's lender having the property appraised by a Wisconsin licensed or certified independent appraiser who issues an appraisal report dated subsequent to the date of this offer, indicating an appraised value of the property equal to or greater than the agreed upon purchase price. So it's like this is contingent upon it appraising at or above. This contingency shall be deemed satisfied unless within X number of days, and again, that's the appraisal contingency deadline, of acceptance, seller, this contingency, unless buyer within certain number of days delivers to seller a copy of the appraisal report which indicates the appraised value is not equal to or greater than the agreed upon price. Seller may satisfy this appraisal contingency by delivering a written amendment to the buyer within 5 days of delivery of the appraisal report. Now that's 5 days of the delivery of the appraisal, not the deadline of the contingency. Once you send that appraisal report over, the appraisal deadline goes out the window and these new deadlines start. So that's why it's important to hold off on sending over that report, because now all these deadlines start. Don't send it over until you absolutely have to. Buyer within 5 days of the delivery of the report, amending the agreed upon purchase price to the appraised value. Buyer agrees to deliver an accepted copy of this amendment to the seller within 5 days of delivery of the amendment of the seller. So what this is saying is that with the seller having the right to cure, what this means is that if you want to invoke that, you send over the appraisal report. Once the seller, once it's delivered, not accepted, but delivered, the seller has 5 days to decide what they want to do. And if they want to go ahead and lower the price, they'll send you an amendment showing that the price is lowered. And then you have 5 days to get your buyer to sign it. And then the price is lowered and then you move forward. This offer shall be null and void if buyer makes timely deliver of the appraisal report and seller either A, delivers a written notice that the seller will not change the price, or B, seller does not timely deliver the written amendment changing the purchase price. Buyer and seller shall agree to make other amendments to this offer necessitated by this change in proposed price. So by delivering over that report, you start the 5 day thing, where within 5 days of them getting it, they have to give you an amendment. And if they do, your buyer has 5 days to sign it. Or if you send over that appraisal report, within 5 days, the seller, this offer shall be, not could be, but shall be null and void if buyer makes timely deliver of the appraisal report and the seller delivers written notice or delivers written notice that the seller will not change the price. So what would happen is the seller would send you a notice saying, I'm not changing the price. Also right behind that will be the cancellation of mutual release. Or if it goes 5 days and you don't hear anything, it's now canceled at that point too. And then buyer gets their earnest money back, and then you move on. The important thing to remember about these contingencies, though, is once you start that chain, you can't stop it. So that's why I recommend, especially if you take the one in the Addendum A, that if the appraisal comes in under the accepted offer price, talk with the buyer and see what they would like to do. Don't send the seller a copy of the appraisal yet. Sending a copy triggers those events that I just talked about. After you do that and you find out what that buyer wants to do, then talk with the listing agent and talk to them about what your buyer is thinking. At that point, then, consider negotiating first. Do the negotiations first. Buyer and seller can negotiate a compromise if they want. Once a compromise is met, an amendment to the offer to purchase would need to be written. So you haven't delivered the appraisal report. You know it's low. You've talked with your buyer. Your buyer said, well, let's see if they'll lower the price. And that could be like your first volley in this. Hey, listing agent, the appraisal came in 5,000 low. The buyer would like your seller to lower the price. Well, let me talk with the seller and see what he says. Day or two later, he calls back, yeah, seller really doesn't want to lower the price. And you as the agent, well, let me talk to my buyer and see what they want to do. You probably already know what they want to do at this point. Talk to the buyer says, well, maybe they'll split the difference, or I'll pay 3 and he comes down 2, or whatever it is. You can then call him back and begin the negotiations. Do these negotiations verbally first. And if you're able to come to a compromise, then put it in writing, put it in an amendment, have everyone sign it, and then also make sure you put the statement in there. Upon acceptance of this amendment, the home appraisal contingency is satisfied. They sign it, and then everything's fine, and you move forward. I'm suggesting that you do these negotiations first. And when I talk about the verbal negotiations, if you want to send amendments back and forth, that's fine too. There's nothing wrong with that. You can send an amendment, they can reject it, send you another one, you can reject it, you can keep going back and forth if you want, or you can do it verbally. But the important thing is negotiate it first until you find that you're either able to come to an agreement where you write an amendment, or you know that you're not. That's when you then send over the appraisal, and then that triggers those different things that I've talked about, where buyer or the seller could say, yes, I'll lower it, here's your notice indicating that I will, or no, they would send you an amendment. Or they give you a notice saying, nope, I'm not lowering it, we're canceling it. The important point that I want to make is if you send that appraisal report over, it triggers these things that you can't stop. Start with negotiations, see if that's able to work, then do the appraisal, sending over the appraisal report. So, about halfway down that paragraph again, if a compromise cannot be reached, send a copy of the appraisal report to the seller. Then, as we discussed earlier, if seller agrees to lower the price, seller will send buyer an amendment changing the price within 5 days of delivery of the appraisal report. Buyer then has 5 days to sign that amendment. If the seller doesn't agree to lower the price, seller will either send a notice indicating that they refuse to lower the price and the offer is null and void, or seller will do nothing, which will then also make the offer null and void. If you have the appraisal contingency selected with the Addendum A and it comes in at or above, it's the exact same thing as if you took the appraisal contingency in the offer. Nothing changes, your transaction continues on. Good practice, again, would be to give them a notice stating that the home inspection, keep doing that, the appraisal is satisfied, and then don't send the copy of that report. You'll have to ask the buyer if they're okay with that. As an agent working with the buyer, I would recommend no, because the last thing you want is like this $20,000 different in appraisal. The last thing I want is that seller to get a hold of it and all of a sudden start creating some problems. And then, well, if we up the price, $5,000, $10,000, I'm sure this problem will go away. You don't want to give them any sort of reason to do that. So far this transaction is going incredibly smooth. I mean, it's no problem. But if this guy knew it was, he knew he underpriced it. I don't think he knew he underpriced it $20,000. I'm not telling him because as far as he knows, because we gave him full price plus closing costs on top. He's happy as can be. He got exactly what he wanted with no issues. So why upset that apple cart? I'm not going to do that. So there's no reason to it. Yes, they will ask, and talk to your buyer. Your buyer might be fine. If the appraisal in this circumstance I talked about came in at 176, buyer could look at that and go, yeah, I don't mind. That's okay. But if there's that much of a difference, no, I would highly recommend that they not share that.
What would happen if you say, okay, the seller asked, buyer's the seller, let the seller.
Yeah.
Nothing.
No.
Well, I want to see it.
No, they should just be happy that they got what they got. And
Okay. I just
Yes.
forward. That's
so it doesn't happen. That doesn't happen with the picture.
It could. I mean, I've seen so many weird things happen in the last 3 years. They certainly could, but a lot of it's going to be, how do you present it? Well, I spoke to the buyer and the banks talked, and they would prefer not to do that. Okay, that's a legitimate reason as to why they would prefer not to. No, as an agent, you won't. There's no reason for you to see it.
That's the part I was told. I don't even see it. All I know is they're
Right. Yeah, I got a call from the lender. They said everything's fine. No repairs. If it's an FHA or VA, you might have to do some repairs. With FHA and VA appraisals, their appraiser also looks at the property to see if there's any repairs that need to be done. And this is an important thing to point out to people who are getting these types of loans, is make sure you understand the difference between the VA inspector / appraiser and the home inspector. And the best way to describe it is, when the VA comes in to do, we had this conversation 2 days ago. When the VA comes in, they'll spend 20 minutes in the house. When your home inspector comes in, they'll spend 3 hours in the house. That gives you an idea as to how thorough the VA guy is for the inspection aspect of it. They're looking for very specific things, and that's it. The home inspector is going to look at everything. So that's why you still need the home inspection, even though that VA appraiser is going to come through and look for certain things. They're certainly not going to look at everything. So they have to understand the huge difference that really exists between a VA appraisal / inspection and a home inspection. Any other questions about the appraisal contingency? All right, well, that was a fast class. That was only half an hour or so. But that was the purpose of today, was just to talk about the appraisal contingency. So as always, if you guys have any questions, please don't be afraid. Call, email me, text me. I'll be happy to answer any way I can. Okay, all right. Thank you. All right, that's what you want to do. Go write an offer.
Hey, have you